there's that. But yeah, it's nice. I've been between working a bunch at the new job. I've just kind of been trying to play a lot of catch up, lot of playing catch up. So
Yeah,
I think,
yeah, I hear you. I'm just reading a lot of indies.
dude, I just picked up from my LCS those TKO. I love how they're publishing their books. You know, TKO, what they've been doing, like publishing graphic novels, or you can buy like a 6-issue set.
Like what titles?
So like Sentient by Jeff Lemire and Gabriel Walta.
Oh.
I think that like won an Eisner. I also picked up Sarah by freaking Garth Ennis and Steve Epting, and they do, like I said, you can do them as like a trade paperback, or you can buy them as like these almost prestige format type of 6-issue comics, and it comes in like a display box, so you can put it on a bookshelf. I am enamored with it. I will happily pay that like slightly higher price tag for the quality of the book, the display, like the creative teams. It's killer. I'm in. I'm all in on it. I might actually do like not an unboxing because they're not really in boxes, but I might do like a revealing or an unveiling of them, because boy, oh boy, does this type of comic book publishing get me excited.
Yeah, right on. I've heard a lot of good things about Sentience, Jeff Lemire's Sentience, but
I'm stoked, man. Like I'm actually I was telling my retailer that I'm gonna catch up on all the X books, but I very much see myself, after I catch up, dropping almost all of the X titles and then just replacing them with indies. Just because I don't want to get into the Cross of Swords 22-part mega super fucking crossover written by a million people. It just doesn't pique my interest for some reason. So that's just me. But we got a couple of gentlemen joining us in the chat here. Of course, Jace Millam saying, let's get ready to rumble.
Yeah. Order drink.
Yes. Yeah. I have water. This is my first completely non-alcoholic Let's Talk Comics in a while, but hey, I'll represent the rest of the sobriety in the chat. We got Aaron Vio saying, hey, happy Friday. Happy Friday to you, my brother. Thanks for popping in tonight. And we also have the one and only Tehillim29 saying, good to see you, Comic Boom and Dark Knight. It's good to see you too, my man. With that out of the way, I think we got enough gentlemen to get this conversation rolling, so I'll intro us up. Hey guys, welcome to the 52nd episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and another co-host in the comic book community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium that is comics, whether it be stories, creators, constructs, or adaptations. We hit it all. This week, of course, I'm rejoined by the comic book and Corona Cape Crusader himself, my friend, Comic Boom. What's going on, brother? It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Dark Knight. I'm glad it's the end of the week. It's been it's been a long week. I'm kind of glad it's over, and I'm looking forward to just venting and talking nonsense with you. I mean, intelligent comic book discussions with you.
This is like the Wizard of Oz. We can't let them know what's behind the curtain.
It's like,
yeah, it'll be a good time as always. We also have Ed Brewer in the chat saying yo, and Samoki Dude just asking us what's up. What's going on, gentlemen?
Samoki Dude.
Good to see you guys. Thank you for joining us. So, as you guys can very much tell, we are discussing kind of the growing cynicism of veteran comic book fans. And this kind of topic I thought of a couple weeks ago, strictly because I find myself with time growing more and more cynical as a comic book fan. And that could, of course, just be that side of me that is getting closer and closer into pursuing a full-on career into the comic book industry. And as I begin to nitpick, I begin to find dissatisfaction in areas that I might have been otherwise satisfied by a couple years ago. So that's why I kind of wanted to open up this conversation, of course, have it with my pal Comic Boom here, who is very much a veteran comic book fan, and with everybody in the chat, because I know we have a wide range of sort of casual readers, longtime readers, the weekly warriors. So I figured this was something worth talking about. Now, I do want to be aware of framing myself as somebody who does want to break into the comic book industry. So I know that I don't really represent all of the fandom. I am looking at these books through this lens of picking apart the tips and the techniques that they're using so that I can pretty much use them myself later on. So I'm curious, and we're going to open this up obviously to everybody in the chat. But Comic Boom, as you've kind of ingratiated yourself more into the comic book fandom as years have gone on, have you found yourself growing more cynical? Have you found yourself growing more accepting, maybe just, realizing that, it's a medium that you love and you just love what you get out of it? Where do you stand on the kind of scale of cynicism versus, how long you've been reading books?
My immediate response to you when you just said, have I found myself becoming more cynical, was to utter that phrase, does a bear shit in the woods? Yeah, I have. But here's the thing. I really do think the way I've always thought of it, I'm always reminded of the words of Mark Waid when I spoke with Mark Waid. I'll never forget what he said to me in 2006 or 7 in Calgary at a Comic-Con. He said something that's always stayed with me, and it's so true. He said that because he's only a couple years older than me, so we're basically the same age, and we were talking. I was venting to him about my frustrations at that time with some storylines for DC, and he said that every generation deserves to have a comic book speak to them. Every generation deserves to have comics speak to them, and that really resonated with me because it's true, and because the older I get, the more I want younger generations to appreciate comic books, and of course. And then the moment a new, young, vibrant creator comes along and I don't like their stories, here I am being all cynical and conservative, because the older I get, the more conservative I get. There's a lot of analogies, I think, in the political spectrum. The older people get, they generally tend to get more conservative, more set in your ways. I'm definitely like that. But at the same time, just like when politics works well, I think what works well for comics is we have the older guys like me that are kind of cynical. But every now and then we get these creators like Donny Cates comes along and, challenges our conceptions of a character and sort of like rocks our world and, gives us a shake and said, hey, quit being so, quit thinking that there's another way to look at this character. So I like that. So my cynicism, I think holds certain people accountable. And maybe I'm a little bit miserable and maybe I bitch and whine too much and I rant too much. But at the same time, I love eating my words. I love a new writer coming along that shatters my expectations. And, to me, it's a cycle. To me, like there's a comic book overturn window. You know how in the overturn window where certain ideas might start off as radical, but sooner or later when they become mainstream, the overturn window moves politically in the political spectrum. I think in comic books we have that. Every now and then we get creators come along that challenges cynical guys like me, and my comic book overturn window moves, whether it's Alan Moore with Watchmen or Frank Miller with Dark Knight Returns, or Donny Cates with Thor, or Jason Aaron with Goddamned or Thor, or Jeff Johns with his Green Lantern run, or Flash Rebirth. I mean, there's always somebody that comes along and challenges. So yes, I'm cynical. It is the way I am. But I love getting bitch slapped once in a while.
I acknowledge my cynicism, but I think I'm cynical almost like opposite to you in the way that I'm actually more and more looking for newer voices, things to add to the medium, readers who, grew up and or came up into the industry reading, I think a higher standard of quality and hence producing a higher standard of quality. So where it sounds like you're kind of a little bit more reluctant to accept new people coming in. I want new people coming in. I'm always pretty much ready to topple the old guard unless the old guard, are firm enough in the quality of their storytelling that they make a very lasting impression. And boy, there are some kids outside having a party and it is really obnoxious, and I hope you guys can't hear it. So let me know and I'll try to situate something. But I'm trying my best to focus on the conversation and not on the trap music going on outside. Anyways, yeah, so it's interesting to me because, I am always looking for the next person, for example, to take Scott Snyder's position. I'm always looking for the next person that has the idea that is both good and financial, and I would say commercially viable enough to become the new status quo. I think my cynicism, moreover, and I think is obviously in like the technical application of the craft. Like that's where I'm really starting to, I think, become more and more dissatisfied with things that I used to love. Like, I would say a couple of years ago, for example, Batman Hush was a top 10 Batman story of all time. Now I wouldn't put it near like my top 20, just because I've become more attuned to storytelling techniques, particularly in comic books. But as we move forward, I do want to address a couple more comments here in the live chat as well. Comic Breakdown says, I love this topic. I feel like I know a lot of people like this. Yeah, I think we all do. The more you go to a local comic book store and the more you interact with comic book fans online, I feel like the more you're going to populate knowing more and more people like this. Samoki Dude says, just wanted to hop in real quick with family. Thanks for popping in, buddy. Have a good time with your family. We appreciate you. Jace, 10 of Swords, son. Not for me. Sounds like a good topic.
I'm not sure. Is Jace saying that Son of Swords or 10 of Swords is a bad series, or does he like it? Or is he being sarcastic?
I think I had called it like Cross of Swords or whatever, because I'm just getting real tired of like them using X10 cross this, that. Who fuck? I don't care anymore. It's just going to just be an X. Comic Breakdown says, Dark Knight, you're a little cynical at times. Yeah, 100%. Like I'm definitely cynical, although I will give myself enough credit to say that I think my cynicism is grounded in understanding the craft of making a comic book and understanding that some of these creators, especially the ones that I choose to review on the channel, I review and I will openly criticize because I know they're capable of more, and they just turned up the music. So I'll give myself enough credit, I think, to say that I feel like my cynicism is guarded in the craft, whereas I think, Boom, your cynicism is very much guarded in you living through and reading through multiple different eras of comic books. You've kind of seen a little bit of everything, right? Like when you started picking up comic books like well into your adolescence, right?
It was well, my formative years were the 80s. I started collecting when I was 7 in 1976, and the 80s were definitely my golden age of comic collecting that I look back on with a great deal of nostalgia. I love the 80s. I love the 80s more the older I get. I'm it's very, very typical. I'm a typical. I'll always look back in the 80s with a great deal of love. I graduated in 87, and so yeah, I love it. And just for what it's worth, I mean, look, I was cynicism is something that happens. It's not necessarily applicable to age. I was quite upset. I mean, I stopped collecting Swamp Thing because I hated it at issue 20, and then Alan Moore came up on issue 21. That's my greatest faux pas in my comic collecting life. Just when I stopped collecting Swamp Thing because I was so upset with it, that's when Alan Moore made it a better comic. But in any event, cynicism, I think there's healthy cynicism, and then there's being actually resentful of the comic book publishing. And I think that's the difference in terms of what's happening right now. I think a little bit of cynicism, I think there's healthy cynicism in an industry that drives it forward, and it challenges, and the editors will say, hey guys, look, we're reading the readership here. They're a little upset. The reviews aren't where we want them. We're not getting the hype and the talk that we want about. We need to change. We need to rock the boat a little bit more. And of course, I think that a little bit of healthy cynicism that drives creators forward in trying new things is good. Where I'm a little bit concerned now is where I think we've crossed. I think in certain areas of comic book culture right now, we've crossed a Rubicon into sort of some ugliness and personal attacks on creators, and it's not just become about the stories, it's become about personal things like politics, and that's where it gets very, very unfortunate, where people, because of their politics, we're criticizing their creativity, and we're not even going to buy their comic because of something that has nothing to do with their skills as a writer. And that to me is a Rubicon that's been crossed that I find deeply disturbing. It's one thing for me to be ranting and raving. People can ignore me. I'm a cynical bastard. It's at times that's all right. But I'd like to think I've never, openly attacked anyone personally. Although, one has to wonder that. I will say this. When I was younger, it never even occurred to me that if I didn't like a story, it's so weird. But I remember when I was like in my teenage life, I never thought of criticizing the writer. I just found a way to make the story work in my head. I would never do the equivalent of being angry at a writer when I was younger in my, 15, 16. I would just, if I didn't like the story, I wouldn't buy it. But now, as I'm older, I find myself criticizing the writing and the writer and being more analytical, being more critical. And that's something that maybe has just come with age. And I do find, though, if I'm brutally honest, that I miss that innocence I had. I had more, I gave the comic book more of a life of its own when I was younger. I gave the comic book universe the benefit of the doubt. And I found a way to make the story work in my head. And I enjoyed it in certain ways more sometimes because I had that innocence. Whereas now, because I'm more cynical, I'll opt to criticize the writer and the lack of creativity as opposed to getting involved in the story itself. Like, I mean, let's face it, you might not like death metal, but to use an example, there's a difference. We can easily rip apart death metal in certain areas if you don't like the structure and how it's paced, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also the other side where you can get lost in the crazy, zany fun of it, notwithstanding that. It is a mindset. It is a mindset. And I think the older you get, I mean, everything is a choice. And your mindset as you choose and what you're doing as you read a comic, I really think it matters.
But it's like, the one thing I'll give you, though, is that I think that let me start this over. Should comic books continue to be this art form, and I'm not saying it is completely, but should the status quo be a complacent style of storytelling that is only appealing to people that shut off the logical side of their brain? And that's where I'd say 100% no. I look at comic books as a storytelling medium that is on par with cinema, prose, you name it. And I actually really value the fact that as I get older, I appreciate higher quality art because, first of all, one, as I think, and I'm not saying this is for everybody, but as I've been able to sort of intellectualize what's going on in a comic book, I've come to appreciate the good stuff even more. And it applies to most other art forms. Like I rewatched Spirited Away, the Studio Ghibli Miyazaki film, like a week or two ago for the first time in years. And it's not a perfect movie, but I very much appreciate everything in that film that compensates for its sort of shortcomings. And those things compensate so well that although this is nowhere near a perfect film, it's still a top 10 film in my book, of all time. And so in a way, I think that sort of growing in your understanding and ability to understand what's going on in whatever type of art or narrative storytelling you're absorbing, I think it enhances the experience. And I think that, I don't think that there's a part of me that wishes I could turn that critical brain off. There's actually a part of me, and it might be self-serving, that wishes that the creators turned it on a little bit more, that they made the stories that could appeal to both the people that want to shut their brains off and to the people who really just want to think about what they're reading or what they're experiencing. Because I think that there's a way to do both. I think there's a reason why, when you ask most people what their top 10s are when it comes to comic book stories, you might hear it in a different order, but most of the time you're going to hear a lot of the same names. You're going to hear The Dark Knight Returns. You're going to hear The Watchmen. You're going to hear The Sandman. You might hear Preacher. You want to know why? Because they find this excellent way to appeal to somebody who wants a story to think about and to chew on, and to those people who just want to shut their brain off and experience something and to kind of let themselves float away into an atmosphere. And I think that a strong comic book creative team should be able to do both of those things. But with that being said, Ed Brewer says that he is a cynic. 90% of these books aren't worth the money to me anymore. You know, I can't comment on the worth the money to me anymore thing, because I've been reading comics for less than a decade, and for pretty much as long as I've been reading them, the average issue has been between $3 and $4. But I can say that, you know, in the marketplace of ideas and within entertainment specifically, comic books have never been, and especially now, are not competitive. When I can buy a Netflix subscription with hundreds, if not millions of hours, or sorry, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of hours of entertainment, or I can buy 3 comic books, which might afford me about 45 minutes, depending on the book. Or you know, between the 3 books, that says something. You know what I mean? Comic books are really having to compete out there for our attention and for our entertainment dollars, and there's a lot of that to spend out there. But now the competition is way too high, and I do very much believe that comics need to step that up.
Yeah, and I would make the comment, and I would pose this question to you. I will pose it, and then I'll answer it, and then I'll ask you to answer it, Dark Knight.
Yeah.
And that is, what's the primary way to make cynicism while at the same time having a happy medium? And I think what it is something you've touched upon, and that is to simply have diversity of content. And part of the problem I find that when I focus too much on just superhero comics, I'm more likely to become more cynical. Whereas if I read more indie comics and I diversify what I'm reading, I am generally happier. And I really enjoyed last week just reading different types of, you know, if I'm just reading superhero comics, especially with DC and Marvel making pretty big mistakes right now, namely by having fiefdoms. There's
Oh, well, I think Boom got booted out. I don't know how much of that you guys could hear. Let me know when he had cut out, just because I'm not entirely sure. But I know he's having some connection issues. And if I can sort of pick up on what Boom was discussing here, we've talked about it many times about how DC and Marvel have been having this massive issue with giving various big name creators too much control of their space, and that sort of overlap between all of them really muddies the water in between them, and that is not very good for the cohesion of the overall universe and of their various continuities. So I can speak that much on it. But you know, I think that there should be a happy medium. With that being said, while we're waiting for Boom to get back, I think we can go through some of these live comments here. Jace says that, Ed, that's a good point. How much more of the dissatisfaction is because of the value of the books as forms of entertainment, and as they've diminished due to the increase in cost. 1980 comic books 40 cents, today $3.99. That's 898%. Normal inflation for the same time period is 212.9. I think that's certainly a big part of it. You know, for me, I'll gladly pay the $4 premium for a single issue if the quality of the storytelling is good. But again, I am very much in this sort of odd space where I also want to become a creator. So that's what I'm looking for. And I think our pal has rejoined us.
Sorry, I just changed. I went on my iPhone instead of my computer. I suspected that I might have problems. I should have known better.
It's all good. No worries. I tried to follow up to what you were saying the best of what I could. And, you know, how we've talked on many occasions about how DC and Marvel were giving too many big creators too much control. And all of those different sort of fiefdoms are muddying the water in between them to a point where it becomes hard to maintain a consistent continuity. And that's where it sounded like you were going. But feel free to evolve on that now that you're back.
Well, when I think of some of my favorite runs at DC in my lifetime, one of my favorite characters is Batgirl. I loved the Batgirl run, and the Batgirl was never. I mean, I can't remember the exact sales, but I don't think it was ever like a top seller at DC. But it was, you know, it was. But I loved Batgirl because she wasn't always tied up with Batman stories or doing other such things, and I love the classics, the Ostrander Suicide Squad run, and I loved a lot of I loved a lot of the obscure series, and I bought Batman animated comic books that when they didn't have high print runs. I bought them because I really enjoyed them. There was diversity there of content, and it's just, I think that's very important when you have that diversity of content. And of course, the problem now is we have more diversity than ever before, and the frustrating aspect of it is, in many ways, we have the diversity, and I'm not helping myself. I got to learn to embrace the diversity more and collect more indie comics and read more indie, because there is a legitimate point. And you've said this to me before too, and I admit to my hypocrisy. I buy comics that I don't like all the time. I review comics I don't like, and that's that's my choice. But it's also, it's hard. Why am I? If I'm bitching about being so cynical all the time, then why don't I start reading something different? And I really do think, I do possess enough self-awareness to acknowledge that. And I think that a lot of people, a lot of my fellow YouTube reviewers that I know and love, some of them would probably acknowledge that they do the same thing.
Mm. Yeah, I think that it's you're definitely not the only person that's doing this. I've fallen upon many people, both in the online space and in my LCS, for example, with like them saying, "Oh, I'm going to drop Dark Knight's Death Metal after I get that Robin King cover," and I'm like, "No, drop it now!" Because they don't like it, but they want that cover, and you know me, just that the awareness of the industry and how the industry works, that actually kind of feels like a knife kind of digging into my chest a little bit, but I'm likely taking it a little bit too much to heart, literally. But it's an odd space, because comic books are not only an art form, but very much something that has its own very, very present speculators market for collectors. And those two things very much drive the industry and the sales of the industry. And at times can be very conflicting, with comic books, especially really reaching with a lot of these sort of gimmicky marketing ploys, whether it be a variant cover or, something colored differently or whatever. It shows, really that the industry is domineered by different forces at different times, and it does kind of articulate the lack of stability. Ed Brewer says he's at the point, though, that he'll let you, as in you, I think us, find these great new books creators, then I'll consider a purchase. That's my cynicism. You know what? I will take that responsibility in hand. I promise you this: because I expect myself to drop a number of these X titles, I expect myself to be picking up a lot of new independent comic book series. So I'll definitely let you know, Ed. Aaron Vios. Sorry. Go ahead, brother.
No, you go ahead. Read Aaron Lowe's comment.
He says, both DKN and Boom, your cynicism comes from experience, albeit different from each other. Got to remember to define the difference between your critiques and the typical cynical douche. I would like to agree with that. I'd like to think that we're not just being cynical douchebags. And again, I think Boom and I, and you said it as well, Aaron, our criticisms very much come from two different spaces. Comic Boom has been reading comics all of his life, and he's seen it grow and change and evolve throughout the years into so many different forms, whereas admittedly, I've been reading comic books for maybe 6 or 7 years, and I'm looking at it from a technical point of view. I very much, in ways, am starting to feel like Martin Scorsese when he talks about comic book movies, but I'm actually talking about comic books to comic book people. And mind you, I disagreed with Martin Scorsese's comments about comic book movies, but I can see how I would come off that way, just from the point of the quote unquote craftsman, not calling myself the Marty Scorsese of comic books, although I'd like to be there someday. But it is what it is. Let's see. Aaron Vio says the cliche back in my day. Sorry. Yeah, you see a lot of that. Like, one thing that I've come across a lot on the internet, especially, are those old school comic book fans saying, well, where are the action scenes? Why aren't they fighting? where's the tits? And I know that's a little bit of my partner in crime here. He's always looking for a little bit of tit action, and
Absolutely.
there's nothing wrong with that. But you do very much fall in, not he doesn't fall into those categories, but you do get into those categories of comic book fans that have expectations that are entirely based around the past. They want comics the way they are used to comics, and they only want them that way. And I'm curious, Boom, because I know that you very much do fall into that camp, that you like a little bit of that comic book bam pow along with a little bit of tits and ass. But my experience from talking to you also says you're willing to try new things. You're willing to let the industry kind of come into its own in ways that you might not be as familiar with. So how do you sort of reconcile those two almost contradictory natures of being a veteran comic book fan?
Well, I mean, I don't know if there's so much that I need to reconcile other than I just traditionally what I normally do is that I go to the comic shop, and if something catches my eye, I'll pick it up. Now I have been forced to develop the habit that I have to go and read preview magazines, and I've got to go online, and I gotta look at the FOC dates now, because my retailer no longer orders enough comic books for the shelf. If it's a new comic, my retailer takes his own educated guesses as to what might sell. He orders very, very few new comic book copies for the shelf because the market just isn't there, and it's only 20% of his business. And so so there's a downside to that, but the positive side is that, at least for me, I am paying more attention to final order cutoffs. I am paying more attention to the titles that are coming out, and I do follow comic book news, but I am in the minority. And I think you are probably like me to a certain extent, that you also follow comic book news and you have some idea what might be coming out. But for the vast majority, for the next generation of potential comic book readers, they should not have to take the responsibility of looking through a previews magazine or watching YouTube videos of final order cutoffs for orders for new comic books that might be coming out. There's something that this is a flaw in the industry, and until that flaw is addressed, I think it's going to foster more and more cynicism with the growth of the speculation market. And I say this because, as a speculator myself, I think I hate to say it, but we speculators are hurting the industry.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what possible good? How many new readers are we going to get to Wonder Woman? Now that the premiere issue by Mariko Tamaki, an Eisner Award-winning writer that a lot of young teenage girls like, they bought her Harley Quinn, young adult graphic novel. How many of them are going to, 14-year-old girls or 15-year-old girls, young adults, are going to go into a comic shop and pay $25 for the premiere issue of her run on Wonder Woman because the spec market is so excited because it's the first appearance of Liar Liar? It harms the industry, and it fosters cynicism. So I know you. I'm sorry I went off on a tangent there, but I feel compelled to say that I actually think that there's the strengths of the comic book industry are also the same things that in many ways drive my cynicism. And that's the paradoxical nature of this discussion. The spec market is great. It fosters interest by all of us, by us current collectors. At the same time, I really do think it pushes a lot of readers away from comic books. It pushes new readers away. It heightens the perception of inaccessibility, because I mean, my God, when a retailer throws a $10 price tag on a book that came out yesterday, and it's $10 and it hasn't even been sold yet. Number one, I still maintain that should be illegal. I still think that should be against the law, but that's just me being a dictator. But anyways, the whole system here for comic books, I think, has to change before because before we can get interested, you asked me about, about what comic books I can connect to and how. Well, part of the problem is finding a comic book to connect to. Just finding out what's out there can be a challenge, and that's a legitimate issue.
Sorry, I got a little bit distracted by this horrible music going on outside, but I can understand that. And a big part of the issue is, first of all, you started talking about the having to deal with a final order cutoff. In no other industry do you have to order a new product, a story without anything to go off of 3 months in advance. That's insane. That's absolutely fucking insane. And for your retailer and mine amongst thousands of others to have to gamble with their sort of business investment like that is mind-blowing. And I am very much split on the idea of comic book speculators, because I think that speculators also very much are a detriment to the storytelling in comic books, because they will, as implied in their name, speculate and sort of purchase based on spectacle. And what happens is the comic book industry responds to that by creating more spectacle over storytelling, right? And to be frank, sometimes it really, really does bother me, and it does kind of get me to the point where you go through an era like now where people are talking about Dark Knight's death metal, and I do see a lot of folks really coming around to sort of my side of the argument, even agreeing that death metal is not a well done story, and yet they're saying, "Oh, but I'm going to finish it. Like, oh, I'm going to keep buying. Oh, I want to get the Robin King cover." And to me, not only are you sort of acting to the detriment of the industry in a financial way, you are killing the sort of creative product of a comic book. Sorry to say, but it is what it is. And I think that's one of the things that the comic book industry needs to sort of work around, because like you said, a great number of their strengths are also to their detriment. I find that most of the comic book industry strengths that are beyond the fandom itself are really only kind of effective in the short term. They boost short-term sales, not long-term sales. And clearly the comic book industry is not seeing a growth in long-term sales. So what do? Well, we have to think about it. And clearly that's something that publishers aren't doing, or at least the big two. Let's see here. Jace asks, maybe more sophisticated readers. We expect more from our stories now. I would say I certainly do, but I very much think that I'm in the minority. When I talk about my distaste for Dark Knight's death metal, or even that first issue of DC's Dead Planet, a lot of people gave it rave review 10 out of 10, and I was like, this is like an 8. I have some problems with it, and maybe I could just be in that really, really, really small minority of people that might try to look for something more sophisticated than like sophisticated warrants. But I don't know. Certainly I think there is also that kind of group of comic book fans that don't want sophistication, and I still think they are just as much present, if not more so, than the fans that want sophisticated stories. I don't know. What do you think about that, Boom?
Well, Jason Melanie says that we expect more from our stores now. I think he means stories.
Yes, yeah.
But I will say though that I've said for I have said for years that comic book sales have been dropping, and I've got friends on YouTube that I respect that have always at times have countered me and said no, comic book sales are fine, and then they'll refer to Comicron and even Mr. Jackson on Comicron, who composes those numbers, says it's a very healthy industry, et cetera, et cetera. No, it isn't. Even though there's been a growth, and I don't care if there's 20% growth in the last 2, 3, 4 years. It's garbage. It's per capita compared to book sales. It's deplorable. And quite frankly, where am I going with this? Well, I believe that people are far more scrutinous of the stories than uh, than we've been maybe led to believe. Uh, you alluded to the fact that a lot of people hand out 10 out of 10s for quality stories like they're handing out candy. There's so many like websites that just are nothing but stooges for the big two, and they give out random 10s, and you can tell some of them, you can tell by reading the review, they haven't even read the bloody comic book, for God's sakes. And but I actually think that overall sales are low because I think that people expect more for $3.99, and they sure as hell expect more for $4.99 or $5.99, which the sales continue to increase. So, you know, I know it as we're talking here. I don't want to get more and more cynical. I mean, there are some bright lights. I think it's important, if we're talking about cynicism and the collecting of comic books, that at some point, you and I are both going to have to answer the question, well, if things are so bleak, why the hell are we still collecting comics? Well, that's because we love them, and that there are some really brilliant creative minds out there. And the latest one, you know, Ed Brubaker, I just want to give this a shout out. Ed Brubaker, Sean Phillips, Pulp, fantastic. I highly recommend it. But so every now and then, the one of the benefits of being in a sea of cynical, bleak stories is that the really good stories, they really shine, and you can really, you know, if you find one, you remember it, and that ultimately is the satisfaction that I get. And the other thing I want to be very clear on this is that I actually enjoy ripping apart a really shitty comic book. I do. I love going in my backyard, cracking open a Corona and bitching about Bendis. It's cathartic for me. So, you know, I was talking with the guys at Weird Science about this, and text, like, I thoroughly enjoy it. I set up my backyard. I'm under my birdhouse. I got my Coronas, and I get to bitch about a comic book. That's fun. I enjoy it. So sometimes I turn the cynicism into entertainment for myself, and it's cathartic. And that's straight up, that's the bloody well truth. Because why? I mean, because, you know, you might say, well, why would I do a YouTube video over something I hate? Well, I don't actually hate it. I love, it's sort of like Darth Vader. I love to hate Darth Vader. You know what I mean? I mean, I love, it's funny. I mean, I read Young Justice number 17. It is so badly written, the dialogue, that I actually read the dialogue to my wife, and she thinks I'm mentally retarded. I mean, it's entertaining. It's entertaining sometimes. So sometimes when you have a real bad comic, you have to turn it into entertainment. Try reading some of this garbage out loud, and the cynicism will turn into entertainment.
Yeah. Well, so there are a couple things I want to unpack there. One of which is that I think that healthy criticism is very important, because there is such a thing as toxic positivity, because I think toxic positivity very much breeds complacency.
I like that word. I like that. Toxic positivity.
It happens. It very much happens. I mean, you know, I see a comment way down here. You know, I think it was Tevya or Tehillim questioning, you know, why does the speculator market still exist after it pretty much almost killed the industry single-handedly in the 90s? Why does racism still exist? Like, you know what I mean? That's an exponentially more horrible problem that we've recognized for, you know, decades. And yeah, that still exists. It's just human nature. But in the same way that I think that, well, I'm not comparing like toxic positivity in comic books to racism. Let me just fucking put that out there real quick. But I do think it's very much worth mentioning the complacency that comes with toxic positivity. And you see that in stories like Death Metal, where people praise Scott Snyder for the garbage storytelling that he has been doing for the last 4 years. And it's continued to snowball until we've gotten to something like Death Metal that is completely and utterly lunatic and nonsensical. And I've been making this point for fucking years now. And people like to believe me only when it's too late. You know what I mean? I do very much think that in the same way people might look at me as a hypercritical reviewer that just likes to shit on things, I very much look at the people that give 10 out of 10s like candy as something far worse, potentially a greater evil. Because to me, I think if structured well, criticism is a very helpful thing, whether or not the comic book creators read those reviews or not, because I think that for as much as a lot of them claim to be thick-skinned, they're not. but what have you. And in my personal opinion, I actually have found it exhausting to review books that I don't like. I actually get physically exhausted. Those reviews take me longer to make, just because I'm like picking things apart and just being reminded why I don't like something. Frankly, I do it one because viewers will ask me to do it. I will put up polls on Twitter and my viewers will happen to vote for the book that they know that I'm going to absolutely tear apart. And if that's what they want, that's what they want. I don't make the content for me, I make it for them. But another part of me, I think, is also just worth sometimes taking a book that other people might look at as something wonderful and spectacular and say, well, maybe it's not everything you think it is, and just kind of providing that sort of devil's advocate sort of perspective. But I frankly don't like doing that often. I would probably much rather spend my time looking at a book that does things successfully and point out what it's doing that is so successful within the page. But to each their own. Although I did find my Death Metal 2 review a little cathartic, mostly because I could throw in scary movie clips and DJ Khaled. So that was fun. But
I was going to say that one of the, you mentioned about sometimes having our being challenged, and maybe if sometimes I wonder that. Like, for example, I was not a fan when I heard of the New 52 was coming out. I thought it was a terrible idea. I really did. And it might be confirmation bias, but it was generally as bad as I thought it was going to be. Although I did like Wonder Woman and I like Batman Court of Owls. It had its high points. However, there was always a part of me that said to myself, well, you know what? I'm old and set in my ways. And we got it. DC is trying something different. And I admired them for doing that. And there is definitely a part of me, I'm not going to lie, that as much as 5G made me nervous, I was kind of looking forward to 5G, because I do think that it's important to have a new generation of heroes. I think we need to have maybe a new generation of characters, of superheroes, that maybe is made to redefine that heroism for a new generation in the 21st century. I mean, look, the 20th century gave rise to Superman, and it all started. We're at the beginning of the 21st, and we're still dealing with Superman. We're still like, we have a new set of heroes yet? I mean, it's been like, granted, it was 1930, it hasn't been quite 100 years, but it's been like whatever, 80. And so, you know what I mean? So sometimes that's what I mean about. Sometimes I think we all need sort of a collective bitch slap. I mean, even with Frank Miller's Batman, isn't it about time that maybe we tried a different incarnation of Batman? In a sense, we kind of got a slightly different Batman. Snyder's Batman is different, and everyone has their own different take. But there is, we do have a tendency to get set in our ways, and I think getting set in our ways breeds cynicism, and that's the irony of it. Is that the cynicism, if I'm successful in my cynicism, then nothing's going to change, because I don't want nothing to change. I want comic books to be written just for me. And yet, frankly, every time a real good comic book, the next great comic book that comes out, usually defies my expectations. Like, Something is Killing the Children is fantastic. Devil's Highway I just reviewed is fantastic. I mean, I'm trying different the Black Label series, the horror comic books, I'm thoroughly enjoying them. I never thought DC would do that. I mean, we need, the boat has to be rocked once in a while, and sometimes maybe it has to be sank.
Yeah, I agree. I do believe that things need to shift and change, especially in an industry that it was pertaining to the big two specifically, like to recycle storylines, like to recycle characters. And I mean, I've said it on multiple episodes of this show. I am very much a proponent of retiring Bruce Wayne, Clark Kent, and Diana Prince for a little bit, and maybe letting another generation take over, because I recognize, one, the sort of necessity to keep those intellectual properties going, right? Like, we need a Batman, we need a Superman, we need a Wonder Woman, because those are identifiable brands that sell things, but also they're iconic, right? They're symbolic of a number of many things. But I am also very much ready to see a DC universe where maybe the entire next generation of characters takes over rather than just seeing Dick pick up as Batman for a little bit, Wally pick up as Flash. Let's move forward in time. Let's have a DC universe where, Dick Grayson's Teen Titans teammates are now the Justice League. What dynamic does that breed, right? Because now we're in a situation where our Trinity is no longer Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. Our Trinity is probably going to be Batman, Flash, and probably the new Aquaman, right? Because Garth. So I very much think those are a lot of things that are very creatively rich, fresh, can still resemble the things that we love, but move the industry in a very positive direction. So I very much hear you on that. And, I think just being aware of the fact that comic books are cyclical, and it's not like Bruce Wayne, Clark Kent, and Diana Prince will disappear. We'll get them back. We know it, right? They make money. But I'm ready to give those other characters a chance because I love them, and I'm ready to see them move on from just being B-list characters. And under the right hands, I think they can be very much more than that. So I agree with you, actually. I hate to disappoint the peanut gallery, but I agree with Comic Boom very much on this kind of angle of the conversation. I did also want to thank very much Aaron VO. He just tipped the show $20, and I did want to read his chat, his comment as well. So thank you very much, Aaron. I appreciate that contribution and your generosity. Let's see. So we have he just said, keep it up, bro. Looking forward to these streams every week. Thank you so much, man. We look forward to having you as a member of the community and a very present part of the conversation. So thank you so much, man. And if anybody would like to contribute to the channel in the same way that Aaron so generously did, there's a Stream Elements tip link in the description below. All of that goes back into the channel, by the way. Gear, new things to review. So if that's something that is up your alley or something you're capable of doing, please feel free. If not, you're more than welcome to leave a like button in its place or hit the subscribe. We also have our pal Joe's Geek Show just saying, oh, yeah, y'all made it. We did indeed. We are here. I will start kind of skipping through a couple of these so we can somewhat catch up to the live chat because I'm absolutely horrible at keeping up with these things. Jay says, and I think this was regard to your connection breaking off, those beavers in Canada are trying to take a Friday night off and jumped off Boom's wheel. Let's see. We got Tevi Smokeless saying, good to see you. Good to see you too, buddy.
Let's see it, Tevi.
Let's see. Yep, it was Tevi earlier that made that speculation market. Tevia also says DCAN and Comic Boom, personally, in my opinion, I think we need the big creators like Bendis need to go away and take a huge break. I mean, I think Bendis particularly needs to take a huge break. I don't think that means that all the big creators need to take a huge break. In fact, I think there are a number of big creators that continue to excel at their craft and make great stories. So do I want Donny Cates and Chip Zdarsky and, I'm trying to think of other big people that I actually don't hate right now. But, do I want creators like,
Venditti?
Venditti? I wouldn't call him big, though. I love him. I still consider him kind of a hidden gem. But do I want the Donny Cates and the Chip Zdarskys to step away from books just because Bendis and Scott Snyder are not hitting their stride? No. Do I think very much that could be a positive thing in a case-by-case basis? 100%. But I don't necessarily think I am the arbiter of who should not take a break from their career. So I will bow out from that gracefully. I don't know, Boom. How do you feel? Do you agree with Tevia? Do all of the big creators need to take a bow, or are you more in my camp that it should be more on a case by case basis, or not at all?
Well, it should be a case by case basis. I think it all comes down to, I hate to put all the pressure on the editors, but in many ways, the true unsung heroes of a publishing company are the editors. They're the ones that make the call, and there's no reason there should never be a fiefdom in any publishing industry. If you've got all your eggs in one basket, i.e., one creator, then you're doing something wrong. That's dangerous. I mean, yeah, you can, it's just a dangerous thing to do. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And, it's unfortunate. Now, hey, it all comes down to sales. I mean, look at Marvel, for example. You got the Hickman camp and you've got the Donny Cates camp. You really have two universes. You have the Hickman X-Men universe, and you've kind of got King Hickman, and you got his little principalities by, you know, Teeny Howard and Ed Brisson and all those other writers writing the titles underneath, all the X titles underneath them, and Matthew Rosenberg and what have you, and then you got Donny Cates and then with Chip Zdarsky, and I suppose maybe that's not bad, but you got to expand more. At least with DC, for example, at least they're going to come. They're coming out with a writers' workshop again, which is they desperately need to do, and you know, so I think they're mindful of the fact that the talent pool at DC, man, it needs to look to the future. I mean, like I said, you and I have talked about this before. When we actually talk about all the writers at DC and Marvel individually, we actually have a greater appreciation for their talent. It just seems to be they seem to get somewhat stagnant. And I think there has to be another thing that would help minimize cynicism is if there was a better relationship between the editors and the creative types. And because we should never see a war between Dan Didio, between Dan Didio and Snyder. That is absolute nonsense. First of all, the editors should be calling the shots. And if the editor's not doing a good job, you fire the editor. Okay. So yeah, they fired Didio. But this nonsense where you're taking lip from a writer or a writer or artist or anything, no. The editor rules the roost. I mean, the buck's got to stop. It's got to stop somewhere, and that's just the way it is. But you know, so we talk a lot about the creative types, but you got to know how to work with creative people. But you also got to know how to bitch slap them too.
Yeah, there's certainly a fine balance, right? Because editors inherently have to be creative types as well. Like editors need to have, you know, a fundamental sort of understanding and in tuneness or intonation with, you know, the craft of telling a comic book and telling a story. And wow, I don't know if you guys can hear it, but these kids have progressively gotten louder with their music outside, and I'm actually like feel like I'm ready to go punch teenagers. I know that's not really like PC, but I'm ready to do it anyways.
You sound so cynical.
Yeah, I'm really, dude, it's perfect. Kids make me cynical outside and comic books make me cynical inside. What a balance. But regarding balance, the writers and the editors need to come to that. And I don't think a big issue is that I mean, I think the biggest problem is, frankly, that Big Two Comics do not have enough editors that should actually be in that position. Like, the editorial role is highly important, very much to a degree that they are such a silent force in the industry, affecting it on multiple levels. And if you have a bad editor, not only does it fuck one book, but it fucks multiple books. They edit, I would say, 1 to 2 handfuls of books at a time. You're talking about a good portion of an entire publishing line. And if that one person doesn't know what the fuck they're doing, you got 5 to 10 books that are just as fucked. So I think a big part of it is, frankly, one, putting the right editors in there, because if you get the right editors in there, they will also get the right writers on the right books. That's part of the role of an editor. That's why you have people, and I'll sing her praises, Karen Berger. You got the Mike Martz of the world. I'd even give Jim Shooter a lot of credit for the way he towed the line. You know, as much as he had very tumultuous relationships with people in the industry, a lot of people respected him because of what he did. And I think the amount of both pride and sort of the way he asserted himself, right? Like, he cared about the product he was generating. Was it always good? No. Do I appreciate the initiative? 100%. Davis Comics also says he agrees regarding the comic books not being worth what we pay for them. He expects more. And to be honest, $3.99 isn't for a story, it's for a sixth of a story. You're right. It's kind of ridiculous. Like, you get to the point where you're paying like $20, maybe $25 for one story. And mind you, like, it's not like you're getting a novel's worth of story. You are getting maybe 2 chapters worth of a novel for $25. And although you're paying that premium partly for the visual art, it does start to generate the conversation as to whether or not the financial investment is worth not only the amount of time you are being entertained, but even just the amount of sheer entertainment. So yeah, I very much think that is worth the conversation. Jace Millum says, yeah, those weird science guys really dislike just about everything these days. I can neither agree nor disagree because I don't talk to them and I don't engage in their content. But boom, I'll leave you to address that.
Oh, I review. I enjoy listening to the guys at Weird Science, and they have been criticized by, well, actually directly by certain specific personalities at DC. I know Joshua Williamson doesn't like them. I know that Snyder talks to them once in a while, and I know that they've had dialogues with more than one person there, and let's just say that they're very mindful of the fact that they're all cynical. They complain all the time. It's hilarious listening to their broadcasts, in my opinion, because they complain about they make fun of people giving 10 out of 10s like crazy because it is, to use their phrase, nonsense. The amount of 10s that are going out, they are very critical, and they're mindful of continuity. They're mindful of story structure, pacing, the whole 9 yards. And they're, not everyone likes them, of course, but that's also why I like listening to their podcast is that it's, I don't always agree with them either, but they're fun. And I review for their site. I have a little bit of a bias. I do review for their, I review Legion of Superheroes. Bendis' Legion of Superheroes, because nobody else wants to review it. Can you imagine that?
Well, I know I wouldn't want to. There's that.
Well, I gave it a 4 out of. I think I gave the last one a 4 out of 10, issue 7. So, and I gave every issue before that, I think, a 6.5 to a 7.5.
Wow, I'm sure you were being generous.
Well, it keeps going down and down and down, and this last one I just had enough. But yeah, you know what? The bottom line is, that's got to tell DC something. When you've got the guys that are the loyal readers, where we're reading every single one of your comic books, and we're being very critical, and we might sound like negative Nellies, but we keep reading the comic books because we love comic books. Maybe, I don't think that we should just be discarded as being, cynical, right? I mean, just because, are you any less an intelligent person because you didn't give Death Metal a high grade? You know what I mean? Just because it sold, it was the top seller last month, or I'm assuming it was. Does that mean that you giving it a negative review, that there's something wrong with you? You should have given it a 10? Of course not, right? And, like I said, at the end of the day, I'm not going to change. Every now and then I might change a bit, but I'm going to be as cynical as I want to be. I like to think I can be cynical in a healthy way, in a way that drives me forward. And my cynicism has drove me more toward the indie market. I've had enough, and that's just the way things go. I'm as I tell my wife, I'm a slow learner, but I do learn.
No, I in ways agree and disagree with what you're saying there. On a personal level, I am very much in tune with that sort of notion of moving more into the indie space of comic books, because that is what I'm coming to. I've been dropping big 2 books in place of Image and Boom Studios and Dark Horse and whatnot, just because, again, I think that's where the more consistent, more highly artistic storytelling is going on. And clearly, I think both of us can agree that we're seeing less and less of that from the big 2. Where, I would also like to discuss is just like this, I'll kind of relate this to Helam's comment here. Yes, toxic positivity does exist. Those 10 out of 10s, I think, are every bit as bad as those guys on the internet ripping up comic books and just screaming about them. It, again, falls into a false sense of complacency. They drive more and more, I think, of the most negative side of the speculator market. You know, when a speculator doesn't read a book and they see something about how highly praised something is, although it might be garbage, they're going to buy 5 to 10 copies expecting it to blow up in price. Now, is that entirely on the people giving, undeserved 10 out of 10s? No. It is both a fault of the speculator market and the toxically positive stands of the industry. But nonetheless, not a positive force within the culture, within the fandom, within the business in and of itself. So, you know, it's a weird compromise, right? Because I can't tell somebody not to enjoy something just because I don't enjoy it, and I'm not really in that business. But I do very much fall into that like court of person that likes to do my best to try to distinguish something that is technically well crafted and something that I personally enjoy. And now, because I consider myself an amateur craftsman of, narrative storytelling, maybe a lot of those two things happen to become one and the same. But, I very much feel like something can still be entertaining, even if it's not, technically bulletproof. I brought up Spirited Away. Spirited Away has almost no plot, right? Like, most of the plot threads that they generate are totally not wrapped up. But Miyazaki is able to curate such an immersive experience in that film, and kind of elaborates on his very simple and identifiable themes so well through the characters that I couldn't give a shit that there's really no plot to Spirited Away, because it's such a great experience and I love kind of consuming the art for what it is. So I think there's something to be said about that. But again, I'm not in the business of telling people not to enjoy something. I just think it's worth pointing out the flaws in something no matter how much you like it. You know what I'm saying? Is that
Yeah.
like, I don't know. Is that too pretentious of me?
No, not at all. Like I said, you know, I think that somewhere in between, we're always going to have I guess there's always going to be people that are overly positive and the ones that maybe are overly negative, and never the twain shall meet. But I think that, as with anything, probably as with anything, just like in our politics, the safe ground is probably somewhere in the center.
Yeah, no,
And
I agree.
because I mean, I think we know what happens in our politics if we have too many on both sides and nobody in the center. It's never a good thing, because you're more likely to have a war if you're just on both sides. But if if everyone's grouped in the center, then they have more in common. And I think that's maybe that's it's hard to say. Maybe it's going to be interesting in the future, looking back at this era of comic book history, to reflect on to what extent is the current comic book market, is it a reflection of the larger toxic political culture wars that are going on right now? Is the left right politics, is it really affecting comic books that bad? I mean, certainly we just had our last debate was on Comicsgate versus SJW, and it was one of the probably more uncomfortable debates or talks that we had. It was certainly uncomfortable for me at times, and I probably got more upset. But that's I think there's something to say that the you can't divorce comic books from the social from the social setting upon which they are being published. Right now, tensions are high. People are either unemployed or they're upset. They're filled with anxiety. Unemployment's high. A lot of people are looking for an outlet, and comic books can be that outlet. And it can be very, very frustrating that when you're looking for an outlet and you're unsatisfied when you engage in that outlet, i.e., pay $3.99 for a comic that sucks, it's going to make your mood worse. And I think that because I think that there's been a general misdirection of where the big two have been going. I think that's been a problem. Although I will say, though, that I think that the indie market has actually gotten better in the last 5 years. The quality of the indie comics has improved, whereas the quality of the big two has gotten much less. But the only reason that hasn't been reflected in sales is because of the spec market, which is keeping the big two artificially high due to the ridiculous amount of dumping and creating of new, uninteresting characters.
Yeah, that's certainly a part of it. I think a definite part of it is the shortcomings of how the industry, the big two particularly, compensate creators. We've talked about it before, especially in regard to Bendis, and how the big two will pay you more if your creator, if your character that you created gets adapted into something rather than your storyline, which I think is a big issue because of course eventually your character is likely to be adapted into something else just by virtue of the fact that it exists. But they're not compensating creators for strong storytelling being adapted, and I think that's the problem. It's one of those things where the spectacle of a new character now becomes rewarded over actually telling a good story that is adapted, and that's a problem, right? Because it's not like the comic book industry is a very fruitful market where creators are making boatloads of cash. It's a struggle, right? And where I don't give Bendis any slack on this because he's a well-established creator with his career, I can see why a lot of these younger guys might want to create more so that they can pay the rent, pay their bills, But it does very much come to the detriment of the industry. So let's see. Let's get into some more live chats here. Tevia says, I personally care about character progression and storytelling, not bullshit storytelling like Bendis garbage, Legion of Superheroes, and Superman, and for aging up my boy John Kent. I'll take that and I'll forward you Dark Knight's Metal because I would argue that there's no character progression or strong storytelling whatsoever. And I would invite you to prove me wrong and to tell me that there's character progression and storytelling within the pages of that. And I know you think very highly of it. You very much bringing up instances of Bendis's work that you don't like, but I don't see you talking about it in the general sense. So I don't know. Maybe your Bendis's bias is showing, but I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Tehillim29 says, Dark Knight Nation, wow, this crackle is getting somewhere. Check out the animated movie Your Name. I will, man. Thank you for the recommendation. Jace says, has an arrow pointing to his icon and says overly positive. Maybe, but Jace, I'll definitely give you the credit as you have your critiques, you have your criticisms, and where I think you are certainly a far more positive comic book reviewer than I am. I will give you the credit of at least establishing your own boundaries and knowing what you don't like, what you like, and very much voicing those things. Let's see. Jace Millam also says, because the best creators can make so much more money and have control over the characters and stories they own. And I believe he's talking specifically about why the indie market seems to be doing so well. And I'm sure that's certainly that's the biggest part of it. That level of creative control over their stories and their ability inherently as artists to make the art that they want to make is very important. And it's a weird dynamic where I find myself even starting to step into these shoes where, I very much want to fulfill those sort of dreams of touching the characters that I love and leaving my mark on characters that already exist. I also realize that there's a good chance that I'm going to be able to do much more in the independent space that is much more creatively satisfying and will likely even be more financially satisfying because, I'm not going through 50 different middlemen. So, yeah, and like Boom was saying, I think we're seeing the independent market thrive for the older, more cynical comic book readers because rather than being upset about what, these certain creators are doing with certain characters and known IPs, they're also telling their own story, and we can't tell them how to treat their own characters. We can only admire what they're doing or dislike it, and in which case you don't have to worry about the fear of missing out because of this large-scale continuity where everything matters. And I say that as somebody who loves continuity, and I appreciate it, and it's one of the things that I think that makes comic books so special. But I can also very much admire the fact that, indie comics release a lot of the unnecessary shackles that the industry can place on creatives. And I very much find myself leaning more and more towards that space for comics. When we were going live, I was talking to Boom about what TKO Studios is doing and just letting their creators produce entire graphic novels at a time. And they're able to distill their creative vision down to the most pure product possible. And I can appreciate that. But I'm I'm wondering, Boom, especially as you find yourself, reading more and more and more and becoming perhaps more and more cynical. Do you think there will ever be a day and age where your independent comic book pull list supersedes your big two comic book pull list?
Um, it could, yeah, I can see that happening. It has fluctuated over the. I mean, I've been collecting for 43 years. I got a lot of comics. I mean, so it's fluctuated. And let me let me just defend for a second. Look, I've collected comic books for 43 years. Okay, so what I mean to say is, I mean, I'm generally I'm young at heart. I love superheroes. I'm a happy person generally, okay? And so a guy doesn't collect comic books on a regular basis for decades and is a miserable person. And neither are you, and neither are the guys at Weird Science, and neither are any of the guys in the chats. We're adults that love comic books. We're good guys. We're good guys. We're a good group of people, no matter what, certain people might criticize us. I mean, I know I remember a cop show once criticized comic collectors as being all psychopaths. I remember watching an episode of Law and Order where a cop walks into a room and sees a guy reading comic books, and he sees he's a psychopath because he reads comics and he's over 18 years of age. I mean, it's the fact is that comic collectors, we are a good group of guys, and I think we need to be defended.
Oh man, I really want to agree with that. I really do so badly, but I do find myself becoming increasingly more cynical of the fandom as much as I am cynical of the industry itself, because it is the fandom that drives the direction of the industry. And if the industry is moving in a direction that I'm not fond of, or that I think might be either juvenile or spectacle over storytelling, well, then that is at the hands of the fandom. And that's perhaps my overly sort of pessimistic nature, but I want to agree with you. Although there is very much that cynical side of me that just finds some of those stereotypes to become increasingly true, which is disappointing. It certainly does disappoint me, because I think it's worth it enough to at least be aware of the fact that the stereotype does sort of exist for a reason. Now, the sort of overarching narrative surrounding a stereotype can certainly change depending on different people's agendas, but they're able to, or that stereotype has obviously been able to gain so much footing for a reason, and it is because people perpetuate those things. So I do think it is very much worth mentioning that those sort of people do exist, that do very much represent that sort of juvenile image of comic books. There are, and I've seen them, you've seen them, but I would like to at least, give you the credit of being hopeful that we'll be able to shed that stereotype one day as a culture, because I do very much think, and I think this is obvious, that comic books are a very rich artistic medium that are capable of doing some really amazing and unique things. So, cheers to perhaps shedding the stereotype, but I do very much think that there are aspects of that stereotype that are present in the community.
Well, and made famous by The Simpsons, right?
Mm.
And I will say though that I always remind people that maybe we're nothing but glorified stereotypes, but the reality is that we gave rise to the most popular movies of all time, and every I'm not the only comic collector who knew that if the comic books were made properly into movies, that they would be the best movies of all time. And I'm right. I was right. All of us were right who dreamt about it, and we were right. And there's I was so many of us were geek before it was chic, and I say that with pride. And and frankly, I've earned my cynicism if I want to be cynical. And I can say somewhat with a degree of arrogance and ego that if I have a newbie comic book reader that accuses me of being cynical, I can with truthfully say that, well, look, I was just like you were like 40 years ago, and comic books are great, but it's okay to be cynical once in a while. I mean, I'm sure that we all have arguments with our best friends. I mean, it doesn't mean that you stop loving a medium just because you don't like a comic book. I mean,
Yeah.
I still say that a healthy amount of cynicism is absolutely crucial to keep an industry alive and vibrant and hold it accountable to be the best that it can be. That's what criticism is for. That's why we're having this discussion. That's why we debate. That's why we disagree. We move the matter forward. We seek to change minds. We seek to share our opinion. And that's ultimately what I like to think a healthy amount of cynicism does for the comic book industry. And it's also what's created a lot of creative ways to survive the pandemic. Retailers are thinking of ways to survive it. DC, Marvel are trying different things with obviously different degrees of success. The indie market is still thriving. Indiegogo is still doing fine. Kickstarters are still doing great. I mean, there's a lot to be thankful for. And the irony, and perhaps the ultimate paradox, is I think maybe some of our healthy cynicism is part of the reason why it's survived.
Yeah, I agree. I couldn't have said it better than you did just now. I think that there's certainly a line to be towed, when it comes to criticism, because it does very much allow. I mean, I think on the most basic level, I think feedback is just generally a very important thing in anything ever, But in the comic book industry, in any sort of narrative art form, I think it is very much worth pointing out where the creators could improve. And I think as an artist, I don't quite understand this sort of echo chamber that I feel like a lot of comic book creatives are trying to put themselves in, because, and it could just be because I am a young up and coming sort of writer, but I find myself more and more wanting feedback from people who know what they're talking about. Like when the day finally comes, and that's very soon, everybody be on the lookout, when I put out the first issue of my own comic, I don't want to be in an echo chamber. I don't want people that and as much as I will appreciate a 100% honest and knowledgeable review if it is positive, or positive review if it is knowledgeable and honest, I don't want anybody to, give me the Dark Knight's death metal treatment, or to say, oh, I don't like this, I don't like this, I don't like this, but also 10 out of 10. I would want the feedback. I want to improve. I want to become better at my craft. And maybe it's because those people up on high have reached the amount of success that I am actively dreaming to attain, and maybe they don't feel the need to. But who knows? It all kind of boils down to, as comic book fans, what are we expecting? And that's kind of where I would like to close out this conversation and ask this one final question of both my partner in crime here and of the live audience, and those watching it, those watching the video later, feel free to comment down below. Is what are your expectations of the comic book industry? It can be either big two or indie, whichever, or both. Are you looking for sheer entertainment value? Are you looking for something that makes you think? Are you looking for something that you can relate to? And on that, where would you put yourself sort of on the scale of new comic book reader, casual comic book reader, veteran comic book reader? I'm curious if there's any correlation between the amount of time you've been reading comics and what you expect from your comics. So everybody, make sure to let us know down below. But boom, what would be your response to that? So clearly, I think we can establish that you are a veteran comic book reader. I don't think I need you to answer that question for me. But what do you want out of your comic books at this stage in the game? And how do you think that differs from what you might have wanted 10, 20, 30 years ago?
I actually, it's a good question, actually. And I actually find myself wanting, I actually prefer to have more and more and more, especially over the last 10 years. I want self contained stories. And I actually prefer one shots. I actually prefer like issues like Batman Annual 2 by Tom King. I really enjoy 20 to 30 page issue one shots that have a theme and a point and make you think. Those are my favorite stories. I enjoy those more than 6-issue stories and six-issue story arcs. That's actually what I really like. And I really like the independent titles. Stuff like, I already mentioned it, but like Pulp. This is just a really fantastic. It's like a movie. I love episodic storytelling where each issue has its own point, its own theme, and you get something out of every issue. And that's what I really like. And I think what's raised the bar for comic books for me is Netflix, is the incredible increase in the quality of TV shows on Netflix and on Amazon and on Apple TV. They've done a really good job. I actually think it was comic book storytelling that inspired better storytelling in TV. I believe it. I believe that storyboards, the use of storyboards, improved movies, and that came from the comic book world. And I think now, I think that it's reached a point where I think comic book storytelling and comic book style of storytelling has inspired a lot of great TV. But I think the reverse is happening now as well, and that's what I look for in my comic books. And because we need to move away from the big events. Economically, it's not workable. We can't have 21 to 51 issue comic book big events. That's absolute insanity nonsense. You have to bring it down, and that means that the writers have to up their game.
Yeah, so I think that I have some similarities in what I'm looking for and some differences with you. I very much do kind of appreciate your suggestion about how maybe the comic book industry has been reflected a little bit in this new sort of premium style of television, because I think that's a really interesting comparison. And I think that sort of argument is given credence by the fact that numerous comic book IP, both popular and not so popular, are being adapted to both television and cinema in droves. I can't begin to tell you how many independent comic books that not a lot of people have read, that the general public have no idea about, that I've been like, oh, this is made from a comic book. I literally just told my coworker the other day, who was raving about Umbrella Academy, about how it came from a Dark Horse comic written by the lead singer of My Chemical Romance. And they were like, no way, this came from a comic. And then they proceeded to tell me about how much they loved the Old Guard movie, to which I said, that is also from a comic. So I very much think that your argument has a lot of evidence within the television industry in particular right now. Regarding what I want out of comics, I would generally like to see things move in the direction of like what TKO Publishing is doing, like what Brubaker and Phillips have been doing, publishing like OGNs in that almost European style format. I would like to absorb one story at a time, rather than parts of a story with a month in between them. It is becoming sort of unbearable, just in how you experience story, in the sort of necessity at times to go back and reread things over and over and over again to put things together. And I also think that I would just like to see the industry taking advantage of what the medium does best. I think you're putting a lot of people in positions that don't really know the industry, right? They might have some sort of understanding or relationship with storytelling in general, but don't quite know comics and what comics can do. And if you're trying to do if you're not trying to take advantage of what comics are, then I think you're inherently doing something wrong. And that's not to be said that you can't try new things, because that's how, you know, these sorts of art forms advance and evolve. But I very much think it's worth putting people in positions of, like, say, editorial power that know how to take advantage of what comic books can do. I would also, I also don't mind those occasional small one-shot issues, because I think that they can be brilliant, and they can very much be diamonds in the rough. We brought up things with, like, Tom King's Batman run, for example, where it seems like his 1 to 2 issue stories are very much the diamonds in the rough that is his entire Batman run. So I think there's a lot of significance for that. And I think you could very much do something where maybe you release OTN, and sort of as a backup feature, you can have like a single issue one shot or something that is, slightly different, or maybe just release anthologies of one shots. Who knows? But I think when it comes to the general publishing line, I would like things released as entire story arcs rather than one of 6, month after month after month after month. Just because it's a better product. You know what I mean? Just as a physical thing to hold and enjoy, they're more durable. You can absorb the entire story, and if you want to do something large scale, like a multi-graphic novel story that you can then maybe do a massive omnibus for, great. But I'd like to read things in digestible bits that make sense and that are not hindered by this really wonky publishing schedule. And regarding content, I don't really care what the content is as long as it's good storytelling. I'm not going to say that comic books need to tell superhero stories, or they need to tell romance stories or Western stories, because I think comic books very much have the capability to do cross-genre storytelling just as much as cinema or prose or poetry does. For me, it's mostly a formatting thing and a publishing thing. But at the end of the day, I think I can speak for most people in the most general sense and say, I just want good fucking stories, man. That's all I care about. I don't care about crazy shiny covers, as cool as they are. I just want to open a book and be able to literally jump into that motherfucker to the point where I forget that I am sitting in a chair somewhere. That's all.
Here you.
And on that, I will acknowledge these last couple of live chats before we come to a close, because we're starting to get some of that good old-fashioned audio crackle, and it is not a friend of ours here on the show. Let's see. Aaron VO says, I'm definitely a casual reader at best, but for me, my number one is ties to reality, something I can relate to. That's why I've always been drawn to Batman. I've spent years fighting depression, and Batman has always been the embodiment of being able to turn tragedy of loss to power and strength. My favorite stories are always stories of real people, real emotions, and real struggles. I think I can agree with you. I mean, I don't think that every story needs to be that way, but like you, Aaron, I very much value those stories that I can make personal connections to and feel like the theme of those stories resonates with my experience in some way, because it is in a way validating, right? But I think the comic book space has room for all different types of stories that do a number of different things, and they can be spectacular and over the top, and they can be down and personal, and they can be a cross between those two things. But I think that at the end of the day, most competent storytellers will have some aspect of their story that people can connect to, whether or not it is something very specific about turning, tragedy and loss into power, or if it's just, a story about a boy and his dog. You know what I mean? The industry allows for that. So, and I think Boom would agree with me in that way. It's nice to see some of our world and some of our experiences reflected in the fiction, but sometimes we just want to see the Guardians of the Galaxy go blast off into who knows where and go on crazy adventures. I think there's very much room for both. Boom, what are you thinking about that?
I missed your question. It was the static was really bad on this end.
Sorry. I was saying, regarding Aaron talking about how he prefers very small and kind of emotionally relatable stories, and I was just saying that I think there's very much a place for that, and that I think that at their core, even the most high octane, over the top stories should have something that allow a person to access them in a very personal way. But I was wondering, would you prioritize something sort of small and personal versus something that is kind of big and over the top?
Well, yes, I would. My favorite Marvel comic right now is Daredevil. Each individual issue of Daredevil by Chip Zdarsky has some theme, has some. It resonates emotionally. You don't need to read the entire each individual issue to appreciate his Daredevil run. That's what makes it so brilliant. That's why I like it so much. That's why Daredevil's been consistently a title that people will collect, even if they don't read the rest of any other Marvel comic. And I think that's what DC is. DC right now, even their titles that are selling well and are finally getting some recognition, like Suicide Squad. Suicide Squad's getting recognition because of one character arc, and that's Deadshot and his relationship with his daughter. It's about emotions. It's about that resonance. It's about those feelings that matter. And that's really, it's character-driven stories, not these big nonsense events that okay, they can be fun, but again, at the end of the day, human beings, we are very simple creatures. We like to be reminded of our own mortality. We like to be reminded that it's okay to feel emotions, to feel sadness and happiness and fear, and that it's okay to fail once in a while, and it's okay that flawed creatures though we are, in the end, everything's going to be okay. That's why I read comic books. That's what I look for in a story, to remind me that if you're going to remind me that I'm flawed, remind me how I can get out of it. Remind me that everything's going to be okay. That's why I like DC Rebirth. It's feel good. And that's why I get cynical when I constantly read stories that remind me that everything is so dark and gloomy and dark and gloomy and dark and gloomy and big event. It loses sight of why I read comic books. And I want more reminders of the best of humanity, as opposed to always the darkness.
I feel that. And I do very much think, though, that the tools that crazy kind of bombastic fiction also allow you to tell personal stories, just maybe not in such a small sort of concentrated way. And you know me, like, my bread and butter are those street level characters where you can get very deep down, personal, and very, very human. But I can also appreciate when you use that sort of accent, right, of something big and crazy and cosmic to tell personal stories, right? I think you can use multiple different tools to accomplish a personal story. But I think if we can agree on anything, is that at their core, these stories need to have something that are kind of emotionally and personally relatable, right, to the reader. We need to have an access point where we can connect with that story, where we can see ourselves experiencing something like this, whether or not it is, very ground level or something that is crazy and big and with flashing lights. Lastly, I'll acknowledge here Tevye Smolka's comment before we get out of here. He says he is definitely a hardcore reader and a casual reader. Okay. And honestly, his favorite stories are, well, superheroes having families like Superman, Clark, and Lois being parents to their son, John Kent, and Peter and MJ. Cool. Yeah, man. I can definitely see why you'd like stories like that for sure. But with that being said, this crackle is definitely kicking our asses. So I think it's time for us to send a very thankful goodbye. I want to thank everybody for watching live. I want to thank everybody who's watching in post, and of course, my partner Comic Boom for joining me tonight, just to be a cynical bastard with me and talk about things we both like and don't like about comics. So, with everything being said, if you guys enjoy this video, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe to both my channel using the big red button down below and using the link in the description to check out Boom. And on that, Boom, any final comments, any videos you want to plug for the evening?
Well, I've reviewed some comic books in the last week. People are free to visit my site and see what I reviewed. The last thing I reviewed, I think, was Batman 96. I'm going to review some more, probably indie comics this weekend. I'm going to review a couple more. I haven't decided yet. I might finally. I'm still working on. Actually, I got God Country. I've been putting that. It's on the back burner in my memory in the iCloud, so I got to pull that and look at it again. So we'll see. I'll post something this weekend.
Yeah, make sure you guys go check out Boom, some of the most unique and individual comic book reviews on the internet, and I can promise you that he is not handing out 10 out of 10s like candy. So I can very much appreciate that, and I think you guys will as well. If you guys enjoyed the video, please make sure to leave a like, subscribe to both channels, and share this video with folks that you think might enjoy this conversation. That is a huge way to helping us smaller guys out. I know Boom is very close to 1,000 subscribers. I just crossed 400 on the approach to 500. So we would greatly appreciate your support. And to close out the show, Aaron VO just says, thanks, DK and Comic Boom. Great stream. A joy as always. Thank you. I agree. And I think this is going to be the Let's Talk Comics duo signing out for the night. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video.